Okay. Our reading today comes from 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 6 through 22. So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill, and when the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, "Pray let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat from her hand." Then David sent home to Tamar, saying, "Go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, where he was lying down, and she took dough and kneaded it, and made cakes in his sight, and baked the cakes. And she took the pan and emptied it out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, "Send everyone out from me." So everyone went out from him. And Amnon said, "Tamar, bring the food into the chamber, that I may eat from your hand." And Tamar took the cakes she had made and brought them into the bedchamber to Amnon her brother. But when she brought them near him to eat, he took hold of her and said, "Come lie with me, my sister." And she answered him, "No, my brother, do not force me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this wanton folly. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the wanton fools in Israel. Now therefore I pray you, speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." But he would not listen to her. And being stronger than her, he forced her and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her with very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, "Arise and be gone." But she said to him, "No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other which you did to me." But he would not listen to her. He called the young man who served him and said, "Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her." Now she was wearing a long robe with sleeves, for thus were the virgin daughters of the king clad of old. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. And Tamar put ashes on her head and rent the long robe which she wore. And she laid her hand on her head and went away crying aloud as she went. And her brother Absalom said to her, "Has Amnon your brother been with you? Now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart." So Tamar dwelt a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. When King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. But Absalom spoke Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced his sister Tamar. I spent my college years as a raft guide in Montana and Alaska, and I was surprised to discover that the more I guided on the river and the more technical my skills were honed and the more competent I became, the more terrified of water I also became. But I can remember the first moment that I truly started to grapple with how dangerous water was. I was taking a whitewater rescue class, and the instructor said to us very bluntly, "If you continue to do this, it's not a matter of if you're going to see someone drowning, it's just a matter of when." And I was reminded of this warning 10 years later when I'm thinking about this equally daunting topic. If you're going into ministry, you're going to come across abuse, and you're going to come across people who've been raped, and it's not a matter of if, it's simply a matter of when. And to broach this topic and this subject, I wanted to reflect a little on what well-intentioned but uninformed care can potentially do to abuse or sexual assault survivors before we accidentally contribute to someone's drowning. So to this end, I want to discuss Absalom, of all people. I want to discuss King David's son and the choices that he makes following the rape of Tamar. But what is advocacy? And what does it mean to long for justice and yet to encounter what violence masquerading as justice looks like? Absalom is no advocate. This is the messiness, though, I think, of sin, that in the awful effects on reality, all either has to be destroyed, like with the flood, or all must be left alone. There's not a lot of middle ground. So on the one hand, Absalom, we see, shelters Tamar, brings her into his household, he provides for her, and he hates Amnon for what he's done. He burns with it. And you could argue, I've often thought, it's very expedient and convenient that his rage is directed at someone who politically is standing in his way. Amnon, by all rights, is in the line of succession, and it's awfully convenient. And yet the text in 13:22 does tell us he hated Amnon for what he'd done to Tamar. On the other hand, Absalom forces silence on his sister. And this is one of the great myths of advocacy, that silence protects those who've been abused. Silence, especially silence imposed, is just another form of abuse. See, abuse is about controlling the other. And controlling the narrative of one who's been raped is an abusive act that simply protects the one who has done the abuse. And it also seeks to control the narrative of the survivor. So Absalom's attempt to protect his sister, it implicates him too, even when he means well. And we find, as always, dear God, that the road to hell is just paved with the purest of intentions. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. We don't have to theorize or imagine what happens after this. The text invites us to see what's rooted in his well-intentioned behavior. It's the sin that's poisoning his actions, his will, and his intent. And again, we don't have to theorize because the text tells us what happens next. And we see the fruit of Absalom's retributive motivations. First, he murders Amnon, and it's murder in the first degree. It's a carefully orchestrated conspiracy carried out by his henchmen. And I pause and reflect, what did this desire for vengeance do to Absalom? Was he born weak? Did he have a flaw as a babe? Did he have a flaw then as a child? Was it him as a lad or a young man? When did the rot truly begin and take root? We don't know. Maybe it was just his first taste of power, his ability to take people who were loyal, who loved him, and use that loyalty and love to kill another, to kill a royal, a family member, a brother. Maybe it just whetted his appetite. Or perhaps he simply felt that Amnon needed to be put down after what he'd done to Tamar. Whatever the case, Absalom doesn't even do the deed himself. He farms it out. And again, we don't have to theorize about what happens next. Years go by. Absalom has been forgiven in the meantime by King David, who, it should be noted, has exhibited the same laissez-faire attitude and policy about the murder of his son by another son as he did about the rape of Tamar by Amnon, and again should be noted as he did with his own rape of Bathsheba. In fact, there's even some ambiguity as to what he was feeling after Amnon's death. The chapter ends with, and the spirit of the king longed to go to Absalom because he was comforted about Amnon since he was dead. Maybe David was thinking, maybe Amnon deserved it a bit. Or maybe he was projecting his guilt onto the next generation. I mean, here his son was murdered as judgment for the same guilt that the father himself, the king himself, is guilty of. Whatever the reason, as I said before, Absalom nevertheless is accepted back into the good graces of the king, and years come and go, and oddly, texts differ. We don't know if it's 4 years or 40 years, but time passes. And Absalom begins to consolidate power. And he gains many friends, and one day he executes, as most of us know, a coup on the kingdom. And David and his entourage are forced to flee for their lives, and he and his advisors, who seem to barely escape, leave behind 10 concubines to keep the house, the text says. And many more things happen in the chaos of the day and in the days to come. But most crucial to our purpose today is this: Absalom arrives that same day at David's house after he's fled, and to affirm his commitment to his cause, to the Israelites, both enemies and allies, he's successfully counseled into raping the 10 concubines that David leaves behind. Absalom's text, his story, his narrative all the pieces are a disturbing warning for me personally. Before I had the experience of being an advocate for someone who had survived sexual violence, I liked Absalom. Perhaps I even really liked Absalom. At least in his youth, he's defending Tamar, perhaps visiting some well-deserved chaos and violence on King David, who seems absolutely frozen in indecision, and at best, some sort of self-guilt. And largely it was because I had no idea that encouraging and imposing silence over another who'd been abused was also abusive. And I empathize, not with Tamar, who ironically is probably the only innocent character in the whole damn story, but it was with Absalom. Yeah, I thought, Absalom. Amnon deserves death, unequivocally. That's how I felt. Yeah, Absalom. Why should I feel bad for David after Bathsheba? After he murdered Uriah, her husband? After he's angry, but he's action-wise, he's largely indifferent to what happens to Tamar. David's become this weak leader, and people are dying and being raped in his kingdom, in his own house. The hard thing, I think, about vengeance, that it became not about Tamar. Even vengeance even silenced Tamar at the same time it was trying to say it was protecting her. It was all mixed up together. No, vengeance became about fratricide, the murder of a brother, which became about patricide, the attempted murder of the father. And it ended tenfold right where it began, with the rape of 10 women, presumably so numerous that their names aren't even recorded. And like Jephthah's unnamed daughter, we are asked to bear witness. Violence done in the name of a father's pride and honor, and the pride and honor of men. And again, we stand witness to the fact that these 10 nameless concubines are raped, the text tells us, so that Absalom's men might be strengthened and encouraged. Abuse is rampant among us. Research finds that 1 in 4 women have experienced some form of abuse with a partner. And further research shows that those numbers are largely identical if you are women in the church or outside of the church. The father in David's house, which was rife with abuse, the father was an abuser, and the sons were abusers, and his daughters, the princesses of Israel themselves, were not above or safe from this culture of violence. And so I guess the question, one of the many questions I think we have to ask is, why are these narratives invisible? Looking over the contemporary subtitles of translators that they've inserted into the text is quite telling. All the ones I looked at, like NAV, NASB, NLV, New King James, NKJV, all of them simply call this section Amnon and Tamar, except, of all texts, the New Living Translation, which does name this text the rape of Tamar, rather than something like Amnon's sin, where Tamar is wholly omitted from the title. Similarly, subtitles for David and Bathsheba are equally interesting. Perhaps it's because Bathsheba is so well known. We see Bathsheba show up in every subtitle. She's not omitted. So we see David and Bathsheba. We see Bathsheba, David's great sin. And my particular favorite, David commits adultery with Bathsheba. So at best, Bathsheba's identity is collapsed into this sinful act where she's his great sin, this object to be reviled and to be pitied for David. At worst, she's implicated in the act. It becomes their act of adultery. Why cannot we call these acts what they are? They are rape. And if we can't bring ourselves to see the horrific violence in the texts that are right in front of our faces, how are we going to see the violence that's present among us, let alone name it? Why are we so afraid of abuse allegations hurting men in this culture that we don't even have the inclination to hear the stories of a survivor and simply respond earnestly with, I believe you? This isn't some far-off problem in Africa or the Middle East, or a problem that's too big for each of us to think about or take on. And certainly there are worthy problems that fall into those categories. And this isn't a problem in which we can say contrite things like God is in control or you should forgive your abuser. No, it's a complicated, messy thing. And it's among us. These are our mothers and our sisters and our daughters and our lovers. And we need to know what resources are in our community. We need to know that in Durham, there's a Durham Crisis Center for women who are abused. We need to know what the hotlines are. We need to know what the rights for people who are being abused, what their resources are. Because there's this epidemic of women all around us who are literally drowning in various forms of abuse and sexual violence. And our call as Christians is not to hide ourselves away, but to pray that we have the ears to hear and the eyes to see when, not if, we are called to be a brother or sister of those who need Christ the most. May the Lord give us those eyes to hear, be those eyes to see and those ears to hear. And working on our faith in fear and trembling, I hope, may serve Him by truly seeing and serving those around us.